On the morning of November 8, 2018, a faulty piece of electrical transmission equipment sparked a fire in the hills of Butte County, California. Strong winds pushed the flames downhill toward the town of Paradise. Within hours, the fire had grown into the most destructive wildfire in California history. By the time it was fully contained 17 days later, it had burned through more than 150,000 acres. It destroyed nearly 19,000 structures. 85 people lost their lives. The event became known as the Camp Fire. Almost everything in its direct path burned. Homes, businesses, schools, and vehicles were reduced to ash and twisted metal. Entire neighborhoods that had stood for decades disappeared in a single day. But in the middle of that destruction, a small number of homes remained standing. These houses were not protected by luck alone. They were built differently from almost everything around them. The homes that survived were built using a method called insulated concrete forms, often shortened to ICF. Instead of a wooden frame covered in drywall and siding, an ICF wall is built from interlocking foam blocks that stack together, similar to oversized building blocks. Steel reinforcement bars are placed inside the hollow blocks, and then concrete is poured in to fill the space completely. Once the concrete sets, the wall becomes a solid slab of reinforced concrete, sandwiched between two layers of rigid foam insulation on the inside and outside. This matters enormously in a fire because of how differently concrete and would behave when exposed to extreme heat. A standard wood frame wall, the kind found in most American homes, is built from thin pine studs, usually about 2 inches wide, with fiberglass insulation packed between them and drywall attached on the inside. Research on house fires has shown that this kind of wall can lose its structural strength in under an hour once fire reaches it directly. In some tests, wood framing has been shown to begin failing in as little as 15 minutes under sustained flame contact. Concrete behaves in an entirely different way. It does not burn. It does not soften the way steel does under heat. Multiple manufacturers of ICF systems and independent standards organizations have tested finished ICF walls and found fire resistance ratings between 3 and 4 hours, depending on the exact product and wall thickness. A test conducted by the Portland Cement Association found that flames spread roughly 5 times slower through a tunnel lined with ICF foam than through one lined with wood. In practical terms, a wall that might collapse in under an hour if built from wood could remain structurally intact for 3 to 4 hours if built from insulated concrete forms. That difference, measured in hours rather than minutes, is often what separates a home that survives a wildfire from one that does not. One of the most detailed accounts of this difference comes from a home in Butte County that was directly in the path of the Camp Fire. The property was reached by the fire around 8 o'clock in the morning, the same morning the fire started, and it was showered with wind-driven embers as flames physically reached the structure. Even with defensible space cleared around the property, decorative landscaping bark near the home caught fire and burned for a sustained period close to the walls. Researchers who studied the site afterward estimated the fire likely reached temperatures at or above 1,470 degrees Fahrenheit at the point of closest contact. Despite that heat, the home's 6-inch thick ICF wall assembly held. The exterior stucco finish was damaged, and a nearby wooden pump house on the same property burned completely to the ground. But the concrete core of the home's walls did not fail, and the structure remained standing while neighboring wood frame homes did not. This pattern has repeated in other California wildfires as well. In wildfires that swept through areas near San Diego, homeowners and architects have described similar outcomes. Rows of wood frame homes destroyed, with a small number of ICF homes left standing in the middle of the damage. In each documented case, the surviving homes shared. It is worth being clear about why wood frame homes fail so consistently in these conditions, because the failure often begins before the main fire front even arrives. Wildfires generate enormous numbers of embers, sometimes carried well ahead of the main flames by wind. These embers can land on roofs, in gutters, against vents, or up against exterior siding. Wood siding, wood decking, and asphalt roofing shingles are all vulnerable to ignition from a single ember landing in the right spot. Once a small ignition point catches, it can spread into the structure itself, particularly if the home has exposed wooden eaves, vents without fine mesh screening, or a wooden deck attached directly to the house. Radiant heat from a nearby fire can also shatter windows before flames physically arrive, allowing embers and heat to enter the interior of the home directly. Once fire is inside a wood frame structure, the thin pine studs and fiberglass insulation that make up most interior walls offer very little resistance. This is why wood frame homes can go from undamaged to fully involved in flame in a relatively short period of time once ignition occurs. An ICF home is not immune to every one of these risks. Exposed wood decking, a wooden roof structure, or flammable landscaping directly against the walls can still create problems, as seen in some of the documented cases. But the core structural walls themselves do not provide fuel for the fire the way wood frame walls do. In several before and after accounts from Northern California, the wooden portions of ICF properties, such as decks, fences, and outbuildings, burned, while the concrete walls of the main house did not. Following the Camp Fire, the town of Paradise updated its building codes for anyone rebuilding. New homes are now required to avoid wood decks and wood fencing directly attached to the structure, and setbacks between homes and flammable material were expanded. According to a case study conducted after the disaster, at least 26 homes and one church in Paradise were rebuilt using fire-resistant methods that go beyond the standard wood frame, including insulated concrete forms and autoclaved aerated concrete, a lightweight non-combustible masonry material. Even so, these updated methods remain the exception rather than the rule. Of the more than 1,800 homes rebuilt in Paradise in the years following the fire, only a small fraction used non-combustible wall systems like ICF. The overwhelming majority were rebuilt using the same standard wood frame construction that failed to protect the town the first time. There are practical reasons this pattern continues, even after a disaster this destructive. Insulated concrete form construction generally costs more upfront than standard wood framing, and it requires contractors trained in a different building process. Most residential construction crews in the United States are trained specifically in wood frame techniques, because that is what the vast majority of homes in the country have used for nearly 2 centuries. Retraining a workforce, adjusting supply chains, and convincing homeowners to pay more upfront for a wall system most of them have never heard of all work against a rapid shift toward fire-resistant materials, even in areas that have already burned once. Homeowners who have made the switch describe a similar realization. Several families who lost homes in earlier fires and later rebuilt using ICF have said they were surprised more people did not know the option existed. In interviews conducted after their homes were rebuilt, some described feeling that non-combustible construction should be more widely known and used in fire-prone regions, particularly given how consistently it has performed compared to standard wood framing in past wildfires. Insurance companies have also taken notice of this difference. In areas affected by repeated wildfires, some homeowners who rebuilt using ICF have reported lower insurance costs or fewer coverage restrictions compared to neighbors who rebuilt with standard wood framing. As insurers continue to reassess risk in wildfire-prone parts of California, the physical materials a home is built from are increasingly treated as a direct factor in how much a policy costs, and in some cases, whether coverage is offered at all. This same pattern reappeared years later. Wildfires that struck the Los Angeles area in January 2025, including the Palisades Fire and the Eaton Fire in Altadena, destroyed thousands of structures across some of the most expensive real estate in the country. Once again, accounts from residents and journalists who surveyed the aftermath described a similar scene. Rows of destroyed homes with an occasional structure left standing, often one built with unconventional, non-combustible materials. One homeowner in Altadena had a house built with exterior walls made of steel, including double-sided steel panels on the doors. When the fire reached his property, it burned through everything on one side of his home, but stopped at his walls. Neighbors on that side lost their homes. Neighbors on the other side, where his house blocked the fire's path, did not. In the same string of 2025 fires, other homeowners who had rebuilt earlier properties using fire-resistant methods after previous fires found their new homes intact, while surrounding wood frame houses burned again. These were not isolated coincidences spread across unrelated events. They were the same physical principle appearing again in a different location. A wall that does not burn cannot become fuel for the fire in front of it. It is worth asking why. Given this repeated pattern across multiple decades and multiple fires, non-combustible construction remains rare rather than standard in high-risk areas. Part of the answer is economic and structural, in the same way it is for American home construction generally. The residential building industry in the United States is built almost entirely around wood. Sawmills, lumber suppliers, contractor training programs, and building codes have all developed over nearly 2 centuries around the assumption that homes will be framed in wood. Insulated concrete forms, steel panel systems, and other non-combustible methods exist, but they represent a small share of the market, which means fewer contractors are trained to install them, and fewer suppliers stock the materials in bulk. This keeps the upfront cost of non-combustible construction higher than it might otherwise be, which in turn discourages wider adoption, reinforcing the same cycle. There is also a simpler, more human reason. Most homeowners do not think about what their walls are made of until after a fire has already taken something from them. Several people who eventually rebuilt using ICF or other fire-resistant systems have said in interviews that they only learned these methods existed after losing a previous home or after seeing images of a neighbor's house left standing while their own burned. The technology to build a wall that does not burn has existed for decades. Widespread public awareness of it has not caught up. Building codes have started to shift, but slowly. Some California counties in high wildfire risk zones have introduced stricter requirements around roofing materials, vent screening, and defensible space clearance in recent years. These changes reduce ember-related ignition risk, which is a meaningful improvement. But most codes still do not require non-combustible exterior walls, meaning a home can meet every current legal requirement in a wildfire zone and still be built entirely from wood. The broader pattern extends beyond wildfires. Insulated concrete form walls also test well against high winds, because the solid concrete core is not vulnerable to the kind of structural failure that can affect wood framing during hurricanes and tornadoes. Some ICF systems have been tested to withstand sustained wind speeds well above what is required in most residential building codes. None of this means wood frame construction has no place in American home building. Wood remains less expensive to build with in most cases, and outside of wildfire zones, hurricane zones, and similarly high-risk areas, standard wood framing performs adequately for most homeowners across most of the country. The issue is narrower and more specific. In regions where wildfire risk is high and increasing, the material used in a home's exterior walls appears to be one of the clearest predictors of whether that home survives when a serious fire arrives. There is also a cost question that only shows up years after a home is built. Standard wood frame construction remains cheaper up front in most cases, which is a major reason it continues to dominate American home building even in high-risk areas. But that upfront savings does not account for what happens if the home is destroyed. A homeowner who saves money building in wood and then loses that home entirely in a wildfire has not actually saved money in the long run. They have simply moved the cost from the construction phase to a rebuilding phase years later, along with the loss of belongings, disruption to their life, and in the worst cases, the loss of neighbors or family members who did not make it out in time. That full cost rarely appears in any comparison between wood and concrete framing at the time a house is first built. The story of the campfire is often told as a story about climate, drought, and wind. Those factors mattered enormously in how fast and how far the fire spread. But at the level of an individual house, the outcome frequently came down to a narrower question. Was the wall in front of the fire made of wood, or was it made of concrete? In nearly 19,000 cases in Paradise, the answer was wood, and the homes did not survive. In a small number of cases, the answer was concrete, and they did.